human being that can actually prophesize the future. Every one of us can say that I predicted the events that are unfolding before us today. But no one can predict what's going to happen tomorrow. From the very time we entered this land, thousands of years ago, there's only been one prophet who's truly spoken the word of God. Only one. Moses, our great teacher, who carried us across the desert, showed us this very place which he could not enter, who showed us the beautiful land that stands before us and told us to have faith in ourselves and to have faith in God. On this very ground in which we stand, on this mountain of the Lord, it is Moses who showed us that there was no God like him, like our God, no power like the power of our God. And no matter how powerful the title any man says that he has, it is our faith in God and God's faith in us through the covenant that makes us who we are. This man who stands before you, this man Jeremiah, he is no Moses. Moses fought against the decrees of God at Sukkot, at Sinai, in the wilderness of Zin. It was Moses who assured that we would prevail against our enemies, beseeched God on our behalf, and ensured our survival. What prophecy have you heard today from this man that demands the God of justice to act justly? The only antecedents of his prophecy is his own sense of self-righteousness. And the only targets of his prophecy are you and I. Never does he address God, God's self, on our behalf, like Moses did. What word of the Lord have you heard that fights for the very people in this room, for whom God has chosen? Instead, we have this charlatan who, for the last 40 years, has lamented and cried about our own human frailty and failings, as if being imperfect is somehow novel in the world. I am imperfect. You are imperfect. This idea that we have to be perfect and everything is on the line due to our own perfection is a matter of great arrogance, self-righteousness. No prophet since Moses has predicated blessings along with curses. I submit to you that no prophet since Moses has actually kept us safe. No prophet has treated with our enemies to secure food or clothing or livestock. No prophet has ever been heeded by the people since Moses himself. Let me tell you a little bit of the history of our people through the eyes of a realist, through the eyes of a covenanted Jew, not just through the eyes of the words and the musing of this man, Jeremiah. Instead of it being the prophets who's driven our people, it has been our kings. Those who have been anointed by God, they are the ones who've kept us safe. It was the great Saul who vanquished the Philistines, and the mighty David who unified the kingdom, and Solomon the wise who expanded God's name across the world, not through prophecy, but through diplomacy. 500 years ago, after our great King Solomon died, our kingdom did split in two. The north went its own way. They had their own prophets. And you tell me, Jeremiah, you tell us that we feel immune to the machinations of global politics. Let me recite to you the words of your predecessor, Hosea, in the north, who said the very same thing that you are accusing us of. Hosea called each and every one of you in this room a whore, an adulterer. He said it was ungodly to have treaties with other nations, to let the marketplace help men become rich. Hosea's vision for the north was simply to go alone, to ignore the nations of the world at our own peril. You tell me that we have delusions of grandeur? It was your own prophet, the prophet of the north, Hosea, who had delusions of grandeur. And it was our king, the king of the north, who tried to make a treaty with the Assyrians to save us from destruction, not the prophet. When our northern brothers were put to the test 400 years ago, the evil Assyrians reaved across the land like locusts, and they sacked the north and laid waste to their towns. But by following the prophet and ignoring the global politics that is around us, the very same thing that you accuse us of doing, by ignoring those global politics for the sake of a ritual to a god, they lost everything. A long history of our people has come down to this very night, this very moment. God promised us a place in the world. God does not break God's promises. Moses is the first and only prophet who showed us this land on his dying day. Are we to forsake our covenant with Abraham? Are we to leave this very spot, the altar of Isaac? Are we to vacate the couch of David, the house of Solomon, because this man tells us to leave? This is the night that is more consequential than any other time from the first night we laid eyes on this land. We give up tonight, we lose everything. We step off into history. We risk losing our own faith, our own people, our own sovereignty. And we have a transcript. In Jeremiah's own words, he says, and I quote, "As for you, give no heed to your prophets or augurs or dreamers or diviners or sorcerers who say to you, 'Do not serve the king of Babylon,' for they prophesy falsely to you, with the result that you shall be banished from your land. I will drive you out, and you shall perish. But the nation that puts its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serves him will be left by me and its own soil, declares the Lord, to till and to dwell on it." God, for thousands of years, has promised us this land. And when we weren't ready to seize it, forced us to live in the desert for 40 years in order to birth a new nation that was ready to seize this land, and punished us for the lack of faith that we had in seizing this land? Do we not remember the story of Joshua and the story of Caleb, who had faith in our ability to take and seize what God has promised us in perpetuity? Do we not remember that? And here comes this man, this so-called prophet, who's telling us what God wants to do. God wants us to break God's own promise. In his own words. The smoking gun is right here, anachronistically. Right? Do not believe these prophets, he says. He himself, of course, being a prophet. And yet this prophet tells us to put the yoke around our neck, to surrender this place to the heathen, to let them into our sanctuary, to eat of our holy sacraments. How hypocritical, Jeremiah, to mash your teeth at our collective imperfection and supposed infidelity to a ritual cult that you hold so dearly, and then tell us to let these idol worshippers into the most sacred abode. What sort of prophet tells you to defile God's house by letting them tread on this sacred ground? I say to you, Jeremiah, You are a phony. You are a fake. You are no prophet. And what have you to say, sir, about social justice? Never have you worked for your daily bread. You have only weaved words and never a blanket. You have smithed out phrases, but never have you sweat over the kiln's fire. For all of us who work hard to wrestle bread from the earth, while you flit away on your little pen, how dare you lecture me on what is just? Is not a full day's work for a full day's pay, a just and right living? Shall not I be able to hold on to what is mine? The city is surrounded. The guard is upon the walls and the gate, standing there night and day. Every extra morsel of food that we give to the weak, to the widow, to the orphan, and to the poor, and to the beggar means that's one less piece of food I can give to that soldier that's protecting us on the wall. I say to you, my friends, if you hope to keep us safe, if you hope to keep your life, if you hope to spare your children, if you hope to survive until the morning, it is diplomacy that we need in this moment. Trust in our King, not in prophecy and this man. Finally, I'd like to close by saying what stands before you is a man whose lamentations we have endured for almost 40 years, who knows nothing of hard work, knows nothing of your life or my life, who has lived off the fat of our labor his entire career, and who has never once asked God to step in on our behalf, to put it all on the line for us, just as your King does for you and for him. This man wants to protect us by destroying us. I'm sick of his hypocrisy, his slavish words and silly laments. What shall we do with such a man? What shall we do with such a hypocrite? Someone so out of touch with how life really is. I say we let him stand up on the wall. Let him protect us. See how he prophesies at the end of a spear. Or perhaps we should do the just thing, the thing that our Torah commands us to do, the thing that God promised us to do, and to put him in the pit and to subject him to the king's justice and to God's justice and let him rot. What's what we should have done a long time ago. Thank you very much.
You can tell you're not British? Oh, like in Parliament, yeah? Yeah, right. We should set the room that way. We should have done it that way. Okay, good. Is she okay? Is she okay? Yeah? Okay, good. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful question, but that's not the topic for tonight. And it would take me much longer than I would have to finish the evening. So hold on to the question. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful question. And as we get a little bit farther into this conversation, this course, we'll have a chance to take up questions like that one. Okay? Would that be okay? Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, sir? What does it mean that we're having this discussion for that? Yeah. It means we haven't figured out the answer yet. That's what it means. You're dealing with the human condition. And while technologies change and politics change, the human condition doesn't change. right? So the human condition looks different than it did before because it's dressed up in different forms, but it's the same fundamental set of ethical issues. What? What does it mean? It means we have to keep working at it. We haven't finished yet. So this evening, I would like to stand in defense of my client, the prophet Jeremiah, and I want to appreciate my colleague's wonderful accusation. I think that his words are very, very eloquent, beautifully presented, articulate, and dead wrong. First of all, beware of anybody who tells you everything's going to be okay. Anyone who tells you it's going to be okay. And that's not just because we're Jewish and we're just generally pessimistic, right? Because it's so easy to feed into the wishful thinking. It's so easy to feed into our desire to close our eyes to real threats. It's so easy to close our eyes to the difficult issues of the moment and to have someone say, well, here's the simple thing. Let's just throw the guy in the pit and all will be okay. That's not what's happening. It's a much more complicated situation. So let's begin at the beginning, as my colleague did, and trace the situation slightly differently. Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. God will be our king forever. You said that. Remember when you said that? You said that just after you crossed the Red Sea. That's the last line of the song that we sang at the Red Sea. Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. God will be our king forever. The king of this land is not that fellow who sits on the throne. The king of this land is God. That's what we acknowledged from the very beginning. We acknowledged that God is our only king. In the book of Deuteronomy, God said, there may come a time when you wish to appoint an earthly king over yourselves. And God said, I'll let you do that. I'll let you do that, but on one major condition, that the king write for himself a Torah, and that king keep that Torah next to himself all the time, so that all of his words and all of his acts and all of his determinations and decisions follow the life of the Torah. That the king revere the Torah, that the Torah is always over the king. God allows us to have a king. God is willing to share the majesty of monarchy for the purposes of governance, for the purposes of defending this land, but only on the condition that the king become an instrument and a vessel of Torah. So let's be very clear. The king is not the state. The king is not the law. The king is an administrator of the law, a servant of God, a vessel of Torah. That's how God imagined it. Now, my colleague is absolutely right. The greatest king we ever had was King David. No one can match him in his power, in his vision, in his leadership, in his glory. But even King David had to learn this. King David, who was the archetype of all of our kings, King David broke the law. He stole a man's wife, sent that man to death in war, had him killed, and you remember what happened. The prophet Nathan came to him and said, Atah ha'ish, you are the man who did this, and you have to pay the price for this. And you are only a man, and you are under the law. This was the radical idea that we as a people arrived at, which is so very different than our neighbors. In Mesopotamia, the king, the emperor, is a god. In Egypt, the king, the emperor, is a god. In Rome, the king is a god. But here in Palestine, in Judea, here in Israel, the king is a servant of God, a vessel of the law, an administrator of truth. And that king's power derives from that law. When the king is no longer a servant of the law and a servant of that truth, the king has lost his authority to rule over us. And that's what has happened in these generations past. That's what Jeremiah has been telling us since the time he was 17. For these last 40 years, this harsh and strange fellow has been reminding us that if we lose touch, that if we lose touch with that, we lose this land. Now, my dear colleague tries to say that we are threatened. But that's not what Jeremiah understood. Because if the king is not the law, and the king is not God, the king is an administrator of the law, if the king is not the state, neither is the state the people. We are a community. We are bound together by a common narrative, a story of how we came out of Egypt and met God at Sinai and observed a certain way of life. The state is valuable to us insofar as it serves that loyalty. If having a country and a government makes it easier for us to observe God's law, then the state has utility. It's important to us. But if it gets in the way of our observing God's law, if it masks the evil that we commit, if it distracts us from the work of perfecting the world, then the state is no longer valuable to us. It becomes an obstacle, not an instrument. It becomes a problem, a challenge, not a helpful tool. And that's what's happened, ladies and gentlemen. The state and the temple that it promulgates, the state and that temple have become obstacles. And what Jeremiah said was, the people will survive without a state. He did not say lie down and die. My colleague is wrong. What he said was, surrender to the Babylonians. So we will become Jewish Babylonians. Right? We will become Jewish Babylonians. And will that be so terrible? There are peoples all over the Near East who now live under the rule of the Babylonian government. And you know something? They do okay. They have been permitted to maintain their local cultures. And they pay taxes to the Babylonian government. They obey the laws, the traffic laws of the Babylonians. They have stop signs in Babylonian. But they maintain their own local custom and worship their gods. The problem here is that what my colleague is asking us to do is to think that the people and the state are the same, and that the king and the state are the same. So that if you criticize the king, you have to be put into jail. People and the state are not the same. And what Jeremiah has pointed out to us is that this insistence on remaining sovereign in the face of the oncoming Babylonian Empire, that sovereignty has become an idolatry. So what if we become Babylonians, Jewish Babylonians? Would that be so bad? Because I have news for you. Following the Babylonians, there'll be other peoples who come through this part of the world. And if we don't adjust to the fact that we are a small people in a world of big powers and find a way to live in that world, we're going to be destroyed. What Jeremiah has offered us is a way to live through this coming catastrophe without losing the thing that is most important to all of us, which is Torah. That core identity, the narrative, the laws, the way of life, the loyalty to the God of our ancestors, that's what Jeremiah has offered us. I don't think Jeremiah is a traitor. I think Jeremiah is a savior. Thank you so very much.
Short rebuttal. My esteemed senior colleague, very senior colleague, has pointed out that the book of Deuteronomy says that we are reluctant to have a king, and if we do, that king has to write a Torah. Do you know where the book of Deuteronomy comes from? Passed down from generation to generation. Did you know that it was lost to us for thousands of years, only to be found by King Josiah, a king who, in his ability to renovate the palace, the walls, and the temple, found the book of Deuteronomy? And did you know that under King Josiah was the first year of Jeremiah's so-called prophecy? So I don't need a lecture on what the king needs to be or not needs to be, because the kings of our memory brought us back just as equally as any prophet could to remember the laws of the old man Moses and what he adjured upon us every single day. And he's right. My colleague is right. The king is not God. I'm not God, you're not God. The king is not God, but neither is the prophet. And especially this man who has been lamenting a world and has been trying to predict our destruction. And yet it is our kings and not our prophets that have been able to secure our freedom. This is Jeremiah, after all. You've heard him for 40 years. I've heard him for 40 years. Do you understand that even if in this one line he says, we'll be okay in Babylon, the rest of what he's written is about starvation, is about seeing our women raped, about mothers eating their children? This is the man we're talking about here. And we know what happened in the north. We know what happened when Assyria came and destroyed our people 100 years ago, 200 years ago. They didn't come and just say, okay, we're now going to rule over you. Did they? What happened? They killed us. They destroyed us. They ground us into the dust. And those who survived were carted off in chains, shipped off to Nineveh, shipped off to the heart of darkness itself, never, ever, ever, ever to be seen again. Those 10 tribes are lost to us. So don't tell me it's going to be okay. Because before we get to the okay, there's a whole lot of hurt, a whole lot of bad. And maybe we'll be lucky if history remembers us, because we too will disappear. And finally, you want to be a prophet. You can tell me how bad our lives are and how hard we need to work. But at some point in your life, can you stand up for us? Stand up for the Jewish people that you have been so eloquently anointed to preach to? Moses did that. Abraham did that. Why can't Jeremiah do that? That makes him less than a full prophet, as I said before. That's why I don't think he's a prophet. He's just a man, and he deserves a man's justice. Thank you very much.
How slick. How fluent. How totally slippery. And how wrong can a man be? How many falsehoods did we just hear? My God, let's go one at a time. Yes, it's true. The book of Deuteronomy was found by King Josiah, a king who was loyal to the Torah, a king who found the book and immediately enforced its law upon the people Israel. And then upon his death, his untimely death, what happened? The kings of Judea threw that book away and went back to their idolatrous practices. The book of Deuteronomy is exactly a testament to a righteous king like Josiah. But once Josiah was gone, tell us what happened next, counselor. What happened next was the kings ignored the laws of Torah. And that's what brings calamity upon this people. But more than that, what brings calamity upon this people is this insistence that there's nothing that can be done except military resistance. Now, once again, he's exactly right. Jeremiah did prophesy horrible things. If we resist the Babylonians, if we stand and fight against the Babylonians, we will get smashed. They are much more powerful than we are, and he's exactly right. Much crueler. But their insistence, their goal is not to destroy us. There is nothing in the Babylonian geopolitical program that necessitates destroying us. All they want to do is control the route, the highway, and the caravan routes. And we'll let them. because we don't need to be in control. We don't need sovereignty at this point in our lives. We can be the religious community, the faith community that God intends us to be, and not have political power. There are times when you need to have political power, and there are times when you can live without political power, and this is one of those times. And to demand political control, sovereignty, that's an idolatry. That's a guy thing. That's a testosterone thing. That's like I need power, I need control. No, you don't. You need a life of Torah. And like so many other peoples, bowing to the emperor of the Babylonians doesn't hurt us one bit. We still make Shabbos. We still circumcise our sons, raise our children to lives of Torah, and live Torah-true lives. Yes, it's true. The Assyrians did destroy the northern kingdom because they resisted, because they refused to surrender. That's the problem. Finally, my dear colleague says that Jeremiah, unlike Moses, never stood up for the Jewish people. Do you think it's easy telling you bad news, you Jews? You think it's easy warning you about coming destructions? You think any of this is easy for him to do? You think he's sitting in jail? If he wanted an easier life, if he wanted a life where everyone would love him, he would have told us we'll be victorious against the Babylonians. That would have made him a national hero. To stand up and point out the obvious. The time has come for us to give up sovereignty. That the time has come for us to surrender in order to preserve our integrity as a people, our existence as a culture. That takes tremendous courage, and it takes tremendous love. It takes love of God and love of Torah and ultimately love of people. I'm going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to consider acquitting this man and allowing him to continue his career as a prophet in Israel. Before we vote, I want to ask the jury if you have any questions for the attorneys in this case. Wait. You need a microphone in order. And here's Bill with the microphone. Hang on, Jan. You get to. Who was the king? The last king was called Yehoiachin, and he was deposed by the Babylonians. And a Jewish governor was put in place whose name was Tzidkiyahu, right? And Tzidkiyahu was then deposed by the people, and that's when the Babylonians came back. Okay, so like we never learn from these things, right? Yes, please, Elon.
Neither of you has addressed the underlying corruption in the society and the things that this prophet was railing against, and whether the society's worth saving.
Neither of us have addressed the problem of the corruption of the society and whether the society is worth saving. Okay, do you want to take that up?
I'm the prosecutor.
You had a few words to say about that.
That's true. Do you think, if I'm now the prosecutor, do you think that this society is any more or less corrupt than any other empire that has ever existed on the face of the earth? Do you think that God's perfection, refracted through the human frailty of human beings, is something that we can actually attain? Now, I submit to you that maybe we should aspire to be better. Who doesn't want other people to be better? But at the same time, corruption just might be the price of sovereignty. And sovereignty is the price we pay, or the tax we levy against ourselves so that we can live freely with our own decisions. You might think it's going to be so great when we get out there. There is no government that isn't corrupt. And if you don't have power, who do you think is going to be on the heel of that corruption? That's why I think we have to not acquit this man, but we have to commit him to the harshest justice possible. If for any other reason, Elon, then to understand that justice is possible through the rules of law, and if a man commits treason, he should be treated as a traitor.
Did you hear what he just said? Corruption always exists, so just close your eyes and suck it up and live with it. And if it gets really corrupt, that's okay too, because there's always somebody who's more corrupt than we are. somewhere on the other side of the world you can find someone who's more corrupt. So just let the corruption go on and let it accelerate and keep going, because after all, that's just the way people are. No! If anything, we are an aspirational people who aspire to be better. Now, maybe we don't like the New York Times to tell us we should be better, or the Wall Street Journal to tell us that we should be better. We consider that a double standard. But when we're in this room, just us, just members of the community, we know we're trying to be better. Just consider for a moment if you took that speech and told it to your child. I don't care if you cheat, steal, murder, lie. Lots of other kids do it. Go ahead and do it. It'll be fine. It'll get you into college. Is that really what you want to say to your children? All of us say to our kids, yes, there are those who cheat, steal, lie, and murder in the world, but you're not going to be one of them. Go to your room without dinner, right? We speak an aspirational moral language because we expect more of ourselves. And that's exactly what Jeremiah has echoed for us. Thank you so much for your question. Next question, please. Yes, doctor. Thank you for helping, by the way. That was very kind of you. Stand up so we can see you.
What kind of life did Jeremiah have? Did he just talk, or did he act on?
Well, my colleague has said that he never worked for a living, which is ironic to hear a lawyer say that. Dr. Oslam asked, what kind of life did Jeremiah live? Did he just talk, or did he have a real life? Okay? We don't know, actually. The truth is we don't have literary, so we just have his speeches, right?
He didn't even write his own speeches. He had a hired person who wrote it for him.
Well, he had an editor.
Okay.
We all need an editor.
His name was Baruch. He followed him around, and he wrote down everything he wrote.
That's true. And my
Imagine
colleague,
if I had a ghostwriter.
my colleague has accused him of not working for a living, and as I mentioned, I think it's ironic that a lawyer says that the guy doesn't work for a living, right? But the truth is we don't quite know. The problem is that all we have is a very sketchy record of his actual life. We have all these speeches that he made, right? We know that he came from a priestly family in Anatot. We know that his family had means, so it's possible that he had a trust fund, right? Okay? Could be. It could be. On the other hand, people needed to work for a living in those days, and he may have had a career of some sort as well. It doesn't seem to be that he was married and had kids, because they're not mentioned, but he did have family members who bailed him out frequently from jail. So that we do know. And his family was well connected, so that's how they could bail him out from jail. That's how they could afford such an expensive lawyer like me, right? Yes.
The coastal elite.
The question is, what makes Jeremiah different from the Judenrat in Germany, Jodenrat in Holland, where the Jews helped the Germans send the Jews that were living there to concentration camp? Isn't that exactly the same thing that you're advising Jeremiah to do?
The Babylonians are not Nazis. The Babylonians are trying to capture control of the highway from Mesopotamia to Egypt. They have let many peoples live on that highway, the peoples that are willing to accept their hegemony, give up their sovereignty, and accept hegemony of the Babylon, become serfs of the Babylonian Empire. And those peoples went on living along the highway as subjects of the Babylonian emperor, right? The Nazis were a different phenomenon altogether, because the Nazis wanted to destroy the Jewish people. Personally, they wanted literally to destroy the Jewish people. The Babylonians have nothing against Jews. The Babylonians have nothing against Jews, right? They simply want to control the highway. Okay? Now, there's a very big strategic difference between that kind of a strategic goal and the goal of the Nazis. So those who gave up Jews to the Nazis, that's a kind of a heinous crime, because murder was the end of that crime. What Jeremiah is recommending is not to give up people for murder, but simply to give up, to salute the Babylonian emperor, accept his hegemony, and go on living in the way that we always lived, which they'll let us do, because they're pagans. And you want to know the wonderful thing about pagans? Pagans are tolerant. Only a monotheist will kill you for your religion. Pagans have no interest in stopping the worship of our God. They respect local cults, just like they respected all the local cults that they've conquered. Their conquest doesn't consist of destroying. Their conquest consists of taxation. We'll have to pay taxes to the Babylonian government. Could be that those taxes are less than what we're paying to the government in Jerusalem, by the way. So, because it's a bigger operation. That's what and allow the Babylonians to control the highway and capture tolls from trade along the highway. You want to answer?
I have a different understanding of both the Nazis' self-understanding and the Babylonian self-understanding. I don't know how much you want me to lecture on this, but I mean, last time I checked, before World War II began, the Germans asked the essentially the European community if they can absorb half of Poland because they were German-speaking. And they wanted to add to their homelands. That's just not about destroying other peoples. They were just trying to grow and bring home people who were just like them to begin with. We also know that every empire who's ever existed on the back of slaves. Even ours. What made our slavery good or less bad is that you could only be a slave for a certain amount of time. 7 years is the maximum. I don't want any one of you to become slaves, ever. But there's going to become a time, if we give up hegemony, that some of us, if not all of us, have to become slaves. That's what I'm afraid of. And if we're going to be non-historical about this, we have to ask, how did those 2,000 years go? Those 2,000 years after we lost our last homeland. How did they go for us? How many of us are left in the world today? And how many of us can stand up a little straighter now that we have our own hegemony? If we're going to be non-historical about this conversation. Super. You were talking about Nazis. I mean,
No, he asked a question.
I know, but
Okay. Thanks. Next question. Who's got the microphone? Oh, okay. Wait. Somebody in the back has the microphone, please.
People were very unhappy in Babylonia.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Our people were very unhappy in Babylonia. If you look at Nabucco, which is the story of all this in the opera, there's a prisoner's chorus where they're...
Yeah. And I'm suggesting to you that the reason why the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and enslaved the people, they didn't enslave them, by the way. They didn't enslave them. The reason why the Babylonians destroyed the city of Jerusalem is because we went to war against them. We killed the governor that they put in place. We refused to pay taxes. We went to war against them, so they came and destroyed the city. But even then, they did not enslave the people of Judea. They brought them to Babylon, settled them by the waters of Babylon, and there we sat and there we wept as free people. We sat and we wept. We lived as free people in Babylon. In fact, not only did we live as free people, what did the Babylonians do? We stayed in Babylon for the next 2,900 years. There was a community in Babylon up until 1948. That's super historical truth. Because we lived well in Babylon, right? We lived well in Iraq. We lived well until 1948, when life became much more difficult. Okay? The Babylonians were not into enslaving. They were just into controlling the highway. Yes, please. Who has the microphone? Yes, please.
Okay, so the Babylonians were not going to enslave us, but they wanted to destroy us as a culture.
No, I disagree. Jeremiah and I disagree.
Kill us. They just wanted to destroy us as a community. The Germans also wanted to destroy us. No, these others were not Nazis, but the desire of the Spanish Inquisition, of Germany, etc., was always the destruction of our culture. And that is only going to be possible with a state that we can call our own,
Okay.
and we can defend.
Okay.
So we're not leaving Jerusalem.
No. I'm not asking you to leave Jerusalem today, but in Jeremiah's time, I disagree with the premise. The Babylonians were not trying to destroy Jewish culture. They had a lot of respect for Jewish culture. They wanted to control the land. When you revolted against them, killed the governor, refused to pay taxes, refused to pay fealty to the Babylonian Empire, they destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Right? They did not, by the way, destroy the populace. They took the populace back to Babylon and let them settle by the waters of Babylon and lived freely there, where they stayed and prospered for the next 2,900 years. So the problem is, the premise is wrong. The Nazis had a different program. That's what makes Nazi oppression unique in history. They're the people who wanted to destroy us bodily. Right? The Romans, the Babylonians were not that kind of thing. The Spanish Inquisition is a whole different thing. Right? The Spanish Inquisition was a whole different set of political issues. Right? You want to add something?
No, but I mean, if I was in Rabbi's shoes, I would begin to reframe the argument around Torah-centered culture, right? Because it's not just a political conversation.
The question, the brilliance of Theodor Herzl in 1897 was to recognize that the world had changed, and it was now time to regain sovereignty, because anti-Semitism in 1897 was different than anti-Semitism was in 1492 and anti-Semitism was in 586 BC. And the difference is that difference. The difference was that difference, whether the enemy wanted to destroy us or whether the enemy simply wanted to control the land we were living on. Who has the microphone? Yes, please.
Why is the premise that we as a people were so bad? We were, as a people, were so bad that God abandoned us and we were going to, and wouldn't fight along our side.
Why was that the premise? Yeah, that's the premise is that you corrupted, that the country became so corrupt. The country was so corrupt that it was ultimately indefensible. And that God would not defend the country anymore. And that God had abandoned the country, and this was the punishment. That's the premise. Now, you can disagree with the premise, but I think that the deeper premise is the one that I articulated, which is the deepest corruption was the worship of sovereignty. The worship of sovereignty. And when sovereignty becomes your God, your idol, and you say, I'm willing to sacrifice everything to preserve my sovereignty, instead of saying sovereignty is a tool for preserving my values, when you're willing to defend, put all of your resources in the defense of sovereignty, that becomes a problem. That's the problem that Jeremiah was pointing out. No, because there's a difference, and the difference is this, and that's what I tried to indicate a moment ago. Israel was established because it was perceived that the nature of Jew hatred, the nature of anti-Semitism had changed, and the Nazis were the most egregious example of that, right? That the world is not interested in allowing Jews just to live. That the world is going to try and destroy us bodily. And the idea of a final solution, the Nazi final solution. So in that set of circumstances, sovereignty is necessary. It's the only way to live in the world and be safe. Okay? But up until then, you could live without sovereignty. Look, my colleague has asked the question, what about the last 2,000 years? And I would say, I agree with him 100%. We survived 2,000 years. Imagine that. As a tiny minority people. And the reason we survived was because we gave up sovereignty. If we had held on to sovereignty, as my colleague has suggested we do, when the Babylonians came and destroyed Judea, we would have disappeared as a people. Or when the Romans came, we would have disappeared as a people. Right? But by giving up sovereignty and saying we are a religious culture that can live under many forms of political life, we maintained our survival. And that was a brilliant strategic move until 1897 when it was necessary to return to sovereignty. Okay? Who's got the mic? We'll do one more question, and then we're going to vote.
Well, a point. This argument, echoes through the generations.
Yes.
In the time of the Roman Empire, the Zealots said, God is with us. We can defeat the most powerful military force in the entire world.
Yes.
Because God is with us. The rabbis said, no, cannot. Give me Yavna with its sages.
Right.
And surrender.
Exactly right.
What's important is to preserve the people and the religion.
Right.
The political sovereignty is for another time.
Right. So here's the thing. So the gentleman's pointing out an interesting point. So this same debate is going to recur in the year 70. In the year 70, once again, the Jews revolted against the regnant power, which was Rome. And Rome sent an army to destroy Jerusalem as punishment for the revolt. Okay? And there were two sides. One side said, we need autonomy, we need independence, we need hegemony, we need sovereignty. That's the zealots. And the rabbi said, no, we don't. We just need to learn Torah. We need a community built around Torah. We don't need material power in the world. And that was the debate in Jerusalem during the revolt. Okay? And what ended up happening is the rabbis left the revolt, cut a separate peace with the Romans, established the yeshiva, a center of learning in Yavne, and survived the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. And that's how Jews survived. Same basic question. What are we? Are we a state, a country with a government? Are we a people with a coherent sense of culture? Are we a religious community with a deep sense of God's presence among us? The question of what is our identity at any particular moment in history. If you say we are a state, then when that state gets destroyed, you disappear as a people. But if you say we are a religious community, you can lose sovereignty and still go on living. Right? And that's one of the debates between Jeremiah and his. No, not necessarily. You have to have sovereignty only when the world conspires in such a way that it says, I won't let you live as a religious community. Then you need sovereignty. Right. Well, it led to that moment when when Theodore Herzl came and said, now it's time for us to regain sovereignty. Right?
What's really interesting is today, 70 years on, 70 plus years on, we are both a nation that has sovereignty and a nation that does not. No one in this room, we're not living in Israel right now. We're living in Encino. Oh my God. And there are this is the third largest Jewish community in the world. There are more Jews in Los Angeles than there are in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem. That is a fact. There are more Jews in Israel than there are anywhere else. There are more Jews in New York. There are more Jews in Tel Aviv than there are in New York. Tel Aviv, New York, there are more Jews in LA than there are in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's number 4. Okay? My point is that we're both, just to buttress the rabbi's point, we are both a nation that has a state and a people that has a community. Our central tension right now in this next generation is essentially those two conversations, those narratives, those stories of our own self are driving us actually apart in a way that they have never had before. And that is going to be the question that my generation has to deal with more than any other, is can we live with both? Because we are unique in the world, amongst all the nations and all the people and all the communities of faith. We are unique in the world. And being in that unique place gives us a lot of energy, excitement, and spiritual uplift, but it creates a lot of tension. And that's a central question for today, not tonight, but today.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the time has come to vote. We would normally do this in secret ballot, but who has time to do that? Right, so here's the question before the jury. Should Jeremiah be convicted of treason and put into the pit to be forgotten forever? Or should be acquitted, raised back up as a prophet, and allowed to walk the streets of Jerusalem? Ready? Everyone have the question in front of them? Right? My colleague has presented the prosecution's case for throwing the man in the pit, throwing away the key and forgetting him. I have tried to defend the poor soul and allow him to return to his falafel stand in central Jerusalem, where he may promulgate truth and a damn good shawarma. How many people vote for conviction for the prosecution to send the guy to prison forever? Traitor to the Jewish people, traitor to the king. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Anyone else? 7. I got 7 votes. Okay, hands down. How many vote to acquit, to let the man off? If the prophecy fits, you must acquit. More than 7, ladies and gentlemen. The court has ruled Jeremiah will be released immediately to resume his career as a prophet. We thank this Crown Prosecutor for his articulate arguments. We thank all of you for your patience tonight. We hope our friend is okay tonight. Next week, please join us for another adventure in the great debates that shape Jewish life. Our guests will be Rabbi Adam Greenwald, and the question is, should the Jewish people welcome outsiders? Should we recruit outsiders? Would you like to see a billboard on Ventura Boulevard that says, "Try Shabbos, it can't hurt"? Thank you all very much. Have a good week. Go ahead. Wonderful. Yes, please.
Defending attorney.
Yeah.
You're defending a prophet. You didn't show any evidence that he actually talked to God or God talked to him.
Right.
Show us the sign.
There is.